Hi, I'm back. How have you been? I hope you had a good week. Now you remember last week we read a book based on Prince Caspian by C.S. Lewis. And remember, it was all about swords and fighting, and the kids were in there and saving Prince Caspian and Narnia again. And I said, I wondered if maybe one of the things C.S. Lewis was saying was that you don't have to be a grown-up to do great things, right? Well, you know that, right? Well, today's story I'm going to read is a true story about a 6-year-old girl called Ruby Bridges who lives in New Orleans and is about to start her first day in first grade. Now, this story takes place, 60 plus years ago. I was in the 3rd grade when this story happened, but it still gives me shivers to think about what Ruby Bridges did and how brave she was. Let's find out what Ruby did. Okay, let's read. The Story of Ruby Bridges, written by Robert Coles, illustrated by George Ford. This story takes place in the South, starting out in a small town in Mississippi and then in New Orleans, Louisiana. Ruby Bridges was born in a small cabin near Tylertown, Mississippi. We were very poor, very, very poor, Ruby said. My daddy worked picking crops. We just barely got by. There were times when we didn't have much to eat. The people who owned the land were bringing in machines to pick the crops, so my daddy lost his job, and that's when we had to move. I remember us leaving. I was 4, I think. In 1957, the family moved to New Orleans. Ruby's father became a janitor. Her mother took care of the children during the day. After they were tucked in bed, Ruby's mother went to work scrubbing floors in a bank. Every Sunday, the family went to church. We wanted our children to be near God's Spirit, Ruby's mother said. We wanted them to start feeling close to Him from the very start. At that time, black children and white children went to separate schools in New Orleans. The black children were not able to receive the same education as the white children. It wasn't fair, and it was against the nation's laws. In 1960, a judge ordered 4 black girls to go to 2 white elementary schools. 3 of the girls were to go to McDonough 19. 6-year-old Ruby Bridges was sent to first grade in the William Frantz Elementary School. Ruby's parents were proud that their daughter had been chosen to take part in an important event in America's history. They went to church. We sat there and prayed to God, Ruby's mother said. Prayed that we'd all be strong, and we'd have courage, and we'd get through any trouble, and that Ruby would be a good girl, and she'd hold her head up high and be a credit to her own people and a credit to all the American people. We prayed long, and we prayed hard. On Ruby's first day, a large crowd of angry white people gathered outside the Frantz Elementary School. People carried signs that said they didn't want black children in a white school. People called Ruby names. Some wanted to hurt her. The city and state police did not help Ruby. The President of the United States ordered federal marshals to walk with Ruby into the school building. The marshals carried guns every day for weeks that turned into months. Ruby experienced that kind of school day. She walked to the Friends School surrounded by marshals, wearing a clean dress and a bow in her hair and carrying her lunch pail. Ruby walked slowly for the first few blocks. As Ruby approached the school, she saw a crowd of people marching up and down the street. Men and women and children shouted at her. They pushed toward her. The marshals kept them from Ruby by threatening to arrest them. Ruby would hurry through the crowd and not say a word. The white people in the neighborhood would not send their children to school. When Ruby got inside the building, she was all alone, except for her teacher, Mrs. Henry. There were no other children to keep Ruby company, to play with and learn with, even to eat lunch with. But every day, Ruby went into the classroom with a big smile on her face, ready to get down to the business of learning. She was polite, and she worked well at her desk, Mrs. Henry said. She enjoyed her time there. She didn't seem nervous or anxious or irritable or scared. She seemed as normal and relaxed as any child I've ever taught. So Ruby began learning how to read and write in an empty classroom, an empty building. Sometimes I'd look at her and wonder how she did it, said Mrs. Henry. How she went by those mobs and sat there all by herself and yet seemed so relaxed and comfortable. Mrs. Henry would question Ruby in order to find out if the girl was really nervous and afraid, even though she seemed so calm and confident. But Ruby kept saying she was fine. The teacher decided to wait and see if Ruby would keep on being so relaxed and hopeful, or if she'd gradually begin to wear down, or even decide she no longer wanted to go to school. Then, one morning, something happened. Mrs. Henry stood by a window in her classroom, as she usually did, watching Ruby walk toward the school. Suddenly, Ruby stopped. Right in front of the mob of howling and screaming people. She stood there facing all those men and women. She seemed to be talking to them. Mrs. Henry saw Ruby's lips moving and wondered what Ruby could be saying. The crowd seemed ready to kill her. The marshals were frightened. They tried to persuade Ruby to move along. They tried to hurry her into the school, but Ruby wouldn't budge. Then Ruby stopped talking and walked into the school. When she went into the classroom, Mrs. Henry asked her, "What happened?" Mrs. Henry told Ruby that she had been watching and that she was surprised when Ruby stopped and talked with the people in that mob. Ruby became irritated. "I didn't stop and talk with them," she said. "Ruby, I saw you talking," Mrs. Henry said. "I saw your lips moving." "I wasn't talking," said Ruby. "I was praying. I was praying for them." And every morning, Ruby had stopped a few blocks away from school to say a prayer for the people who hated her. This morning, she forgot until she was already in the middle of the angry mob. When school was over for the day, Ruby hurried through the mob as usual. As she walked a few blocks and the crowd was behind her, Ruby said the prayer she repeated twice a day, before and after school. "Please, God, try to forgive those people, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them, just like you did those folks a long time ago when they said terrible things about you. The end. Now, here's an author's note. Later that year, 2 white boys joined Ruby at Fran's elementary school. Those parents were tired of seeing the boys get into mischief around the house when they could have been in school and learning. The mob became very angry when those first white students went back to school. But those boys were soon joined by other children. And here's some pictures of those boys and girls who first came back to Fran's elementary school to go to school with Ruby. By the time Ruby was in 2nd grade, the mobs had given up their struggle to scare Ruby and defeat the federal judge's order that New Orleans schools be desegregated so that children of all races might be in the same classroom. An American artist, Norman Rockwell, celebrated Ruby's courage by a painting of that first day. And later, when Barack Obama was president of the United States, Ruby got to meet him and traveled to the White House to see where the picture was hanging outside his office in the White House. Wow! Just wow! I was in 3rd grade when this story took place. It took place over 60 years ago in Louisiana. And I can't imagine having to do what Ruby Bridges had to do just to go to school, right? You know, it's really easy for people to be afraid of people who look different, who dress different, who go to a different church, right? We all kind of uncomfortable sometimes with people who are a little bit different. But think about what Jesus always said when he was here on earth. He kept saying, you know, God's kingdom belongs to everybody. And sometimes it takes a 6-year-old girl named Ruby to remind us that that is true. Okay, see you next week. Bye-bye.